Welcome back, everyone. So our first panel this morning is entitled The New Arctic Security Environment, Force Projection and Multilateral Cooperation. And our moderator is Dr. Pauline Pick. Pauline a récemment complété un doctorat en géographie à l'Université Laval à Québec. Elle a obtenu sa maîtrise en géographie à l'Université Paris-Sorbonne et sa recherche porte sur les dynamiques spatiales et la sécurité régionale dans l'Arctique. Et en 2020, elle fut récipiente d'un fellowship du International Arctic Science Committee. Merci Pauline d'être avec nous et je vous cède la parole pour ce premier panel de la conférence.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous d'abord. Je suis vraiment contente de modérer ce panel. Alors, je vous remercie vraiment beaucoup pour cette opportunité. I think I'm going to switch to English now, but I will be happy to take questions either in French or in English after the discussion. So I think this panel entitled The New Arctic Security Environment, Force Projection and Multilateral Cooperation offers a very timely and interesting discussion ahead. Because for one thing, climate change was increasingly referred to as a defining threat, both in the Arctic and outside the Arctic. So it already kind of required us to think about security in that space and security reconfiguration and what it entails for the definition of security. And on top of that, it could be argued that the Ukraine conflict has also redefined Arctic geopolitics, even though it may be too early to anticipate just how much it will be redefined. So it is in that context that, and considering those significant shifts in the global international system, that we have asked our panelists here to share their perspectives about this topic. So I will briefly introduce them, and then they will each have 5 to 7 minutes to make a short presentation and outline some thinking points, and then we will have a discussion. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the Q&A section. So first of all, we have Brigadier General Tom Dunn, who is the Deputy Director for Strategy, Policy and Plans at NORAD and the US Northern Command. We have second, Whitney Lackenbauer, who is Canada's Research Chair in the study of the Canadian North and Professor in the School for the Study of Canada at Trent University. Our third panelist is Ambassador Michael Mann, who I think is now in Tromsø attending Arctic Frontiers, and who we are very lucky to have here as well. And he is the EU Special Envoy for Arctic Matters, so Ambassador at Large for the Arctic. And finally, we are lucky to have also Kimberly Rebenchuk, the Director for Domain and Technology Policy at the National Defense Department for the Government of Canada. So given the notes that I got from these panelists, I think it would be interesting to have Whitney Lackenbauer open the discussion with his notes, and then we will go forward from here. So Whitney, you have about 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dr. Peek, and thanks, Yuri, for the invitation to be here and to be on such a distinguished panel. I'm going to do something a little different for my opening comments. I'm going to speak on a very specific topic, NATO and climate security, as what I see as an evolving nexus for Canada and an opportunity for Arctic leadership on the resilience front. The NATO 2030 agenda emphasizes that climate change is the defining interest of our time. And at the 2021 Brussels summit, NATO heads of state and government agreed that NATO should aim to be the leading international organization when it comes to understanding and adapting to the impacts of climate change on security. This is quite a statement. And it's clear that NATO and its individual nations like Canada have an important role to play in understanding and addressing threats stemming from or exacerbated by a changing climate both globally and regionally. After all 3 of NATO's core tasks, collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security, will be affected by climate change. So it's a threat multiplier, it's a crisis multiplier, it's a shaping threat that is altering and in the future is likely to dramatically alter the environments in which allied militaries operate, which will make future operations increasingly complex. For NATO to remain operationally effective, it needs to understand, anticipate, and prepare for changes and challenges, because changes to the environment are going to affect freedom of operations and maneuver in environments with greater temperature extremes, sea level rise, significant changes in precipitation patterns, increasing intensity and frequency of extreme weather events that are going to test the resilience of our military forces and enabling infrastructure in the Arctic, but also elsewhere in the world. And this requires innovation to ensure the equipment, personnel, and infrastructure are resilient. Climate change, of course, also shapes the geopolitical environment. It leads to instability, geostrategic competition, and creates conditions that can be exploited by state and non-state actors that threaten or challenge our alliance. Again, many create Arctic thinning ice narratives around these lines as well, which we might talk about and probably debate in the Q&A period. Last year, NATO approved its climate and security agenda and then its climate change and security action plan at the June 2021 summit. I see this as creating space for Canada to play a leadership role in the alliance, particularly because it aligns with our commitment in the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework for Canada to expand our Arctic leadership role internationally. Now, that stated, our contributions are not only isolated to the Arctic, but given the nature of the panel, that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to argue that Canada is very well placed to support all four pillars of NATO's work on climate security. And first is enhancing awareness and understanding of how climate change will affect security interests in the alliance. NATO acknowledges it needs to monitor and track climate change more closely, which means investments in research, data sharing, and analysis. It also means including climate change considerations into work on resilience, civil preparedness, defense planning, readiness, and overall ways that we conceptualize and act on deterrence and defense. In the Canadian North, we're all aware climate change is affecting the physical and security landscape, bringing about an evolving set of challenges, including things like floods and wildfires that threaten communities and critical infrastructure. And this places more demands on first responders, on emergency services, and on the Canadian Armed Forces to help people in time of need. In terms of current and future operating environments, our militaries need to remain operationally effective in harsh conditions. And we can speak about specific domains if people are interested in the Q&A period. I will say that the prospect of opening of shipping lanes that could change the security in the equation in the Canadian Arctic in particular is still highly speculative, and I'm very much not convinced of the competition for Arctic resource narratives that sometimes prevail in these discussions, but we can debate that later. Simple takeaway on this point is that many of the changes not only pose engineering and technology challenges, they also need to be factored into operational planning scenarios. And Canada, I think, is well poised to lead efforts to better understand how NATO can be more attentive and responsive to the effects of climate-related crises on vulnerable or marginalized populations who are often particularly at risk from direct and indirect effects of climate change. This fits with our Women in Peace and Security agenda and other Canadian priorities. Second is pursuing adaptation and enhanced resilience in the face of security challenges linked to climate change. This requires whole-of-government approaches to achieve 7 NATO baseline requirements for resilience. Many of these are tied to climate change. How are we managing power and telecommunications grids and ports and airfields and other critical infrastructure that my colleagues will speak to? In ensuring robust and resilient supply chains and information networks. And then in bolstering civil-military cooperation and civil preparedness through comprehensive whole-of-society approaches that are also leveraging private sector and NGO partners. We also see a heightened demand for allied militaries to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And Canada can help lead the way in discerning how NATO can shift its mentality to not just cope with the consequences of environment change in training for crisis management scenarios, but also anticipating and then preventing and building resilience in expectation of these crises. Third is making efforts towards mitigation of allied defense and military contributions to climate change. Make no mistake about it, the global impact of climate change requires global solutions. So most of the allied action on climate change mitigation is going to be through other multilateral mechanisms. But in the security sphere, I think NATO should be ambitious. We should seek to achieve the Brussels summit goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from military activities and figure out ways to do so without eroding our effectiveness or our deterrence and defense posture. So Canada can very much, I think, be at the forefront of thinking about the space of how do we green our militaries in ways that actually enhance operational effectiveness, reduce our dependencies on fossil fuels, and incentivize innovative technologies and practice. This ties to our S&T and R&D investments and how we can operationalize diversified energy sources, build resilience in our supply lines. And my point here is, why not use the Canadian Arctic as a test bed? Think of not only the military, but civilian spin-off benefits this could have. And if this helps to work us towards our 2% GDP, then even Senator Sullivan from Alaska, critiquing us yesterday as freeloader, might be happy. Fourth and final pillar is enhancing outreach by strengthening exchanges with partner countries and international and regional organizations. Canada can certainly lead NATO in leveraging international networks, as well as academics and private sector partners, to improve situational awareness, to bolster resilience and capacity building. And I think we can also play a leading role within NATO in serving as a platform for allies to share expertise and best practices or lessons learned relating to climate change and security. I think Kim will probably reference Canada's putting itself forward to host and serve as the framework nation for the NATO Center of Excellence on Climate and Security. I very much look forward to this as a real moment for Canada to play a leadership role and lead this important hub for NATO to work on coordinating research, synthesizing and sharing lessons learned, and ensuring coherence of effort. And again, so that I don't lose the Arctic point of our panel, I anticipate the Arctic is going to be a big part of this in grappling with the local and regional effects of a changing climate, but also then situating the Arctic within broader global forces, both climatic and geopolitical. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those very interesting points, and I think it was a great way to engage discussion. I think I heard that there was some problem with the connection, so I hope everyone in the audience could hear those points, but we can come back to them during the discussion if not. Maybe I would like to continue with Kim Rebenchak, because Whitney already underlined a few points that would maybe be in the continuity of his own talking points. So Kim, you have the floor for 5 to 7 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. And I think my points will complement Whitney's nicely, though we may disagree on the resource, the competition over resources point, which I think we've done a few times before. So thank you very much for having me here today to share some observations on the security challenges in the Arctic, in particular from a climate perspective. It's something very close to me personally. We launched, my team launched the first climate and security team within national defense looking at these issues from a policy perspective. So it's something that I'm very excited and keen to talk to you about. I think it goes without saying, and you probably all know, that the Canadian Arctic is quite vast. It encompasses over 70% of Canada's national coastlines, 40% of our landmass, and it's home to about 130,000 inhabitants. So a very strategic and important part of Canada. From a defense perspective, the Arctic is a strategically important region for Canada as well, because the northern approaches to North America continue to present a potential avenue of attack on Canadian critical infrastructure in both Canada and the United States. Overall, national defense sees the Canadian Arctic as being at an inflection point where climate change, economic scarcity, technological advantages, geopolitical competition are all coming together in a way that make the region more important than ever before. So while we continue to deal with the traditional military challenges around the world, we cannot take our eyes off the greater threats to our planet, and in particular, the impacts of climate change on both the physical and geopolitical environments. Few places on the Earth are feeling these impacts as much as the Canadian Arctic, which is warming at 3 times the global average and experiencing profound physical effects as a result. Climate change has a direct impact and direct implications for Canada's security in the Arctic, where accelerated permafrost degradation, coastal erosion are threatening northern livelihoods and infrastructure, including infrastructure critical for national defense. As we look to address these challenges and risks posed by climate change, we need to increase our resiliency of our defense infrastructure in the Arctic, while ensuring that we meet the growing demand on the Canadian Armed Forces without undermining its ability to fulfill its core missions. Accordingly, national defense is undertaking concurrent efforts to adapt defense capabilities to the future security environment impacted by climate change, as well as to mitigate emissions to reduce climate impact of its activities on the environment and infrastructure. For example, right now the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force, are all conducting reviews of the impact of climate change on their activities, and I'm very interested to see what will come out of those and what lessons we might be able to learn. The results of these reports will be able to inform our future planning decisions related to force structure, to operational plans, to equipment and training requirements, and allow us to adapt to the future operating environment. National Defense is also working with researchers, the private sector, and academia to develop innovative solutions to the operational and security challenges posed by climate change. And I'll just point out one quick example for you. It is I hope I get the name right, it's Canada's Advanced Microgrids Towards Arctic Zero Emissions, AMAZE, which is much easier to say. This is a project by Defence Research and Development Canada, which seeks to modernize the power and energy system of Canada's North Warning Radar system so that we can reduce its reliance on fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions. So a really interesting project that we're undertaking. Whitney mentioned shipping, and certainly we are seeing a lot of discussion on the potential impact of climate change on shipping due to a sometimes, I think, perceived reduction in sea ice and ease of transportation and shipping routes across the region. We think a lot of the assumptions, and I think we'd agree with Dr. Lachenbauer, many of the assumptions too optimistic. Many of the predictions that we are seeing are suggesting that these routes will not become usable, certainly not in the Canadian Arctic, at least until well into the second half of the 21st century. So we don't see Canadian waterways becoming a shipping route in the short to medium term, but we do think that this perceived openness could lead to increased maritime activity, which could put demands on the Canadian Armed Forces for things such as search and rescue and assistance to ships that may be stuck for emergency response. I think that climate change is also impacting the geopolitical environment that we see in the Canadian Arctic, and we are particularly interested in what this might mean for countries like Russia and China. We have seen, even prior to Russia's military action in Ukraine, that the Arctic had an increased presence and an increased competition from state actors who are seeking to leverage the political and economic, scientific, and strategic potential of the region. We're seeing that rapid technological changes, including in things like cruise missiles and hypersonic technologies, competition in new domains such as space and cyber, artificial intelligence, are all impacting the ways that states use their interests and are enhancing their ability to project military force in the Arctic. So competitors are not using only military means, but they're also investing in dual use infrastructure and technology, using below threshold tactics to advance their interests, and many of these interests don't align with Canada's. As I mentioned, we are watching Russia and China particularly closely. Russia is already, I certainly imagine many of you know this, the most capable Arctic actor. It continues to invest heavily in infrastructure and advanced capabilities and major military exercises in the region. It perceives the Arctic as critical to its economic and national security, and it places a priority on economically developing its northern sea route. So unlike Canada, which doesn't see our sea routes opening up, Russia is very much prioritizing the ability to use that sea route. They have adopted a national strategy for the Arctic that looks out to 2035, which aims to advance development of the region's resources for oil and gas and improve its military capabilities. So it could be some climate impacts for the region from some of those activities as well. And its strategy also includes commitments towards ensuring the Russian military is properly equipped and trained to deal with the changing conditions in the region. Just a few words on China. So they are a self-styled near-Arctic state, and they have become increasingly involved in Arctic affairs, seeking to establish a strategic foothold in the region, as announced in their 2018 Arctic White Paper, as part of its development of their Polar Silk Road. As they pursue their economic and geostrategic ambitions in the Arctic, we believe China will continue to make use of all levers of state power to assert its role and influence and to gain advantage. We are seeing a partnership between Russia and China that has been increasing in both political, economic, and military terms in recent years. It's driven by mutual interest, and it's something that we'll want to watch very closely in the coming months and years as we see whether the recent sanctions on Russia Russia for its invasion of Ukraine will impact the degree to which those nations may collaborate further in the region. We recognize in Canada and at National Defence that the continued security and defence of Canada's Arctic requires an effective security framework and international cooperation with like-minded allies and partners. And there are a number of things underway, but the one I want to touch on, and Whitney alluded to this, is the importance really of the announcement that our Prime Minister made almost a year ago that Canada would host a NATO Climate Change and Security Centre of Excellence in Canada. And so as part of that, we are working hard with NATO and with Global Affairs Canada to establish the NATO Centre of Excellence. Everything it takes some time. It's a process to set this up and set it up quickly and properly, but we are advancing it as fast as we can. And we really do hope that it will be a place where we can work with our allies and partners to pool our knowledge and to develop multilateral responses to climate change, which is a global security challenge that will be felt keenly in the Canadian Arctic. Global Affairs Canada and National Defence is doing this in partnership with NATO and a handful of individual allies who have expressed interest. So we're looking at enhancing a collective understanding of the climate change security impacts, facilitating an exchange of expertise, a place that allies and partners can come to build their knowledge of how militaries can adapt to a changed environment, to an environment impacted by climate change, how they can develop policies and plans that take account of this climate impact. And then also a place where we can all come to learn how to lower the climate impact of our military activities. So we're super excited about the center's potential to positively contribute to global conversations on climate and security and to support efforts to face the related security challenges for the Canadian Arctic. And I fully agree that the Canadian Arctic really could be a test bed for a lot of the things that we want to look at in this space. So I'm probably running short on time. In closing, I'll just reiterate that we feel that the Arctic is at a critical point where climate change, economic interests, and geopolitical competition are coming together. And in the face of these unprecedented challenges, Canada and our allies must prepare to respond in a manner that adapts to the realities of climate change, strengthens the lives of Northerners, provides increased security, and addresses the ongoing competition that threatens the rules-based international order on which we all rely. So I will leave it there, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim, for those really interesting and thought-provoking points that you just made. So I think now I wanted to go with Brigadier General Dunn, but I think he has some connection issues and he disappeared from the panel. So we will go ahead with Ambassador Mann, if that's right for you, with a maybe broader perspective on an EU perspective on this issue. So thank you very much, Ambassador, and now you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to take part in this. I think, as you say, I'm talking to you from Tromsø in Norway, and I'm talking from the sort of Brussels perspective, so I guess I'll give a slightly different view on things, but hopefully relevant and interesting. I mean, just I won't repeat many of the things that the previous excellent speakers have said. We all know that the challenges that we face. Perhaps I should talk a little tiny bit about our own approach to the Arctic. We have adopted in October last year a new updated Arctic policy document, and it's based on basically three things. Absolutely vital thing, the threat of climate change, the threat of the huge changes that this is bringing, and the threats that it brings to biodiversity, but also whole entire ways of life, livelihoods. And we do, I mean, obviously we're in a very special situation at the moment with the terrible things that are going on in Ukraine. But, you know, seen globally, we all know that climate change is the big long-term existential threat, not only to the Arctic, but to the whole planet. So this is something that we major on in our policy document, and the thread running through our policy is what we call the European Green Deal. This is our big packet of environmental measures that aims to make Europe climate neutral at the latest by 2050, and hopefully before that. Other elements that we bring into our policy is the absolutely vital need for international cooperation. This is an issue, of course, climate change and all the other many challenges that Arctic regions face that can only be best dealt with by us working together. And I'll come on to that in a second, because obviously the world has changed dramatically in the last few weeks. But you know, we believe in, you know, obviously climate change doesn't stop at borders. The challenge of providing sustainable futures for the people who live in the Arctic, that's something that can best be dealt with together. And there are many more. Finally, sustainable development. There's a great tendency for people to think that the Arctic is a nice pristine part of the world with lots of polar bears and ice, but we all know that there are millions of people who live in the Arctic regions. Some have greater challenges than others, but we are trying also with our partners to try and ensure an economic future for these people, and that ties in with the whole Green Deal. Both of the previous speakers have talked about the Canadian Arctic being a potential test bed for future green technologies, and we very much adhere to that as well. I mean, we have a great investment in Arctic research and innovation. We have a great deal of investment in regional development up there. The green shift is already happening, in fact, if you look at the battery factories and the potential for hydrogen production, the wind farms and so forth. So we want to help that shift. And we have, as the sort of centerpiece, if you like, or at least the bit of our proposal that made the most noise in the media. There's much more to our proposal than that, of course, but we talked about a negotiated moratorium on oil and gas and coal drilling in the Arctic. But this is actually a global aim. We're not just talking about it in the Arctic region, but we are, it's the first time we mention it. Happens to be in our Arctic policy document. But clearly this also coincided with, a discussion, an international discussion on energy, the energy market, energy shortages. And of course, this has been massively exacerbated by the situation in Ukraine. But in a way, I mean, there is no silver lining to this appalling situation in Ukraine. But if you're going to look for one, at least this is now focused minds. And I think, we are now all finding desperately fast ways of moving away from dependence on Russian gas and oil. And I think this will accelerate the green shift further. So I'm hopeful that now we realize that we have become too dependent on unreliable partners, and that this green shift should happen sooner rather than later. I think if I'm going to talk about security, clearly this is the Climate Security Summit. Obviously, we have to see things from the EU perspective slightly differently from the previous two speakers. I mean, we have our powers and our competencies, and we're not a hard security provider in the Arctic context. So we see security in a broad definition, and of course, climate change, the effects of climate change threaten all sorts of aspects of security and safety, whether it be search and rescue capacity, which is sorely lacking in the Arctic with the increased shipping that's going on. Also, human security, people's livelihoods being undermined by simply the land they live on disappearing. We have potential health pandemics with the permafrost thawing, the ice melting, and the potential for diseases coming from that. And then, of course, there's the environmental security aspect. We've already seen oil slicks in the Arctic because of permafrost thaw causing oil tanks to collapse. So there's a huge range of issues. But of course, we can't ignore the hard security. We can't address it directly in our policy, but of course we can't ignore it. We always took the view previously that that the Arctic was exceptional. There was Arctic exceptionalism. And that although there had been a build-up in military capacity, particularly in Russia, but also exercises from the NATO side in reaction to that, there was no potential for flashpoints based on purely Arctic factors. So it was more a reflection of global positioning in terms of military and spheres of influence more globally. But of course, the world has changed now dramatically, and we're having to reassess that. We still don't see potential Arctic flashpoints, but as the world is now at a major flashpoint, where we're having to take a step back, if you like, and reassess the situation. I think I can't, I've been at this Arctic Frontiers conference the last 3 days. I can't finish my speech without talking a little bit about the only subject really on the lips of everybody here. Everybody agrees that Russia, the pause in cooperation with Russia, absolutely has to remain watertight. There is no way we can have business as usual with Russia when it's engaged in acts of international law breaking and terrible acts of slaughter in Ukraine. But we all also accept and realize that the challenges that the Arctic regions face are there and don't go away. and are probably more urgent. So what everybody has been discussing here in the margins as well as in the sessions is how Arctic cooperation can continue in the future, but excluding Russia. Nobody has an answer to that yet, but all I would say is that everybody agrees that the pause in Arctic cooperation cannot go on in the long term. This work has to continue. There's money committed, there's projects committed, there's expertise, and there is an urgency to deal with this. So, you know, from the EU perspective, we have our own programs and financing and projects that can go ahead, but we're looking to our partners to find ways of working more closely together. And we've had a lot of encouragement from the Canadian side and from the US side, as well as from our own European Arctic countries. So we're hopeful that we can put together a way of pushing this work forward, because, you know, whatever happens anywhere in the world, the threat of climate change and the security threats it brings, and just the simple changes to people's lives that it brings, is ever present and is getting more urgent. So that was a rather unfocused presentation because I didn't have any speaking points, but hopefully I've said everything that I wanted to say, and I'd look forward to having a discussion later on. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. That was actually really interesting, and really an interesting broadening of the perspective from outside the Canadian Arctic to have a more broad perspective on Arctic issues. So thank you, that was very interesting. Just a tiny point for the audience. I just wanted to remind you that you can ask questions to the panelists through the Slido link that you should have access to, and we look forward to your questions. And we will now go ahead with the final panelist, Brigadier General Tom Dunn. So we look forward to hear your thoughts about these issues, and thank you very much. You have the floor now.
Merci, Dr. Pick. Merci, Yuri and the CDA. C'est un honneur d'être ici parmi vous. I will deliver my remarks in English as well, but I would be happy to try and entertain a question in French as required. Apologies for dropping off. You may have seen me leave and come back again. I'd like to blame my technology issues on climate change, but I think that might be a stretch. The unstable home internet is the culprit. It's a pleasure for me to be able to speak on behalf of the commander of NORAD. And for those of you who aren't very familiar with the command, it is a binational command. So effectively, I'm wearing a Canadian uniform. I'm a Canadian sitting in Colorado Springs, but I'm discussing the defense of North America on behalf of Canada and the US, and how our commander and how he approaches that. And within that region, the Arctic is perhaps the most critical geographic portion of that, if you look at all of North America and the defense of North America. So we certainly pay the Arctic significant attention. The commander has a role on the US side for being an Arctic advocate, or an advocate for Arctic capabilities within the Department of Defense as well. So it elevates that for him. And it remains a very challenging environment for us, for operations, for military operations in the North. I think Whitney and others had touched on that as well. But certainly the changes that are occurring in the strategic environment that have been discussed, we cannot assume the continuation of a peaceful and stable Arctic based on the voluntary adherence of all the nations to the international rules-based order. We need to ensure that we are able to be there and protect it. I'll touch briefly on the security environment, but switch a little bit to planning and NORAD and how we're looking out to the future. But I will just start with 4 different vignettes from my career. I'm a C-130 driver. It's been my career in search and rescue within the Canadian military. 4 different things that I'll highlight. Early on in my career were the Turbot Wars and discussions around Canada and its response to Spain. A second one, I flew famine relief into Africa multiple times in the back of a C-130. Early days in my career flying, I overflew the Winnipeg area for the Winnipeg floods in the 90s, and we're seeing almost the identical situation right now, or worse. And another yet is that the commander of Comox, 19 Wing Comox, British Columbia, which is a search and rescue and a NORAD and a maritime patrol base on our west coast on Vancouver Island. I was there in my formative years in the late 80s, early 90s, when the Comox Glacier was quite large. I was there again as the commander of it about 5 years ago when the Comox Glacier had shrunk drastically, and there was a ski hill that was really representative of it near the top where there's no longer any snow. So there's a ski hill with lifts and poles where there used to be snow and there no longer is. Switching to the strategic context, as has been well described, but Russia and China not only more aggressive, but also their capabilities and the threat that their advancement in their technology continues to be able to challenge NORAD and even challenge our own ability to warn our leaders against a threat, to have that assessment of some kind of a threat coming from those, which decreases the decision space of our leaders. And it leads to a risk of deterrence failure for us. Also, the abundance of natural resources in the Arctic makes it a prime location for strategic competition as it continues. The environmental change there will increase access to a certain extent, despite beliefs of how much or to what extent that will be, but it will open up further abilities for resource extraction and bring potential threats closer to home and closer to our shores. Russia has a robust presence in their Arctic region with increasing infrastructure capabilities, looking to exploit natural resources and further development of their northern sea route and further militarization of the points along that route. China, self-described a near Arctic nation with great interests, both extractive and otherwise, in Greenland and Iceland, and being well versed on what goes on in the north. Their Polar Silk Road, mostly aimed at economic exploitation, at extraction, not investment overall. And overall, the importance of an international rules-based order in the Arctic, that freedom of navigation, trade, and the non-militarization that we need to ensure that we remain strong there. I'll switch to the Arctic campaigning. NORAD does attempt to continue to demonstrate our capability, our resilience, our willingness to compete in that region. We have a great interest, the commander does, in domain awareness and the fact and realizing, as our government has, that the North Warning System is basically obsolete. It was a Cold War effort. It was a Cold War instrument that now needs to be further improved upon. And you will have seen statements from our Prime Minister and the President and our Minister of National Defense on efforts to do that. And NORAD modernization being a key part of that, in being able to have the domain awareness to sense what is out there, and being able to also operate there. I think before I broke out, I know Kim had mentioned the fact that the Canadian Armed Forces are looking to review their capabilities, and both on climate change, but also on our capabilities to be able to operate in the north. So we're exercising in the north. It's shown to be difficult. Every time we do it, it demonstrates the challenges that we have. Infrastructure has been mentioned numerous times, but the infrastructure that was built on a basis of permafrost, an existing permafrost, and the ability to maintain it there. As that changes, it crumbles. Runways do not operate or do not stay serviceable. Ramps are no longer usable. There is a potential for research and development, R&D investment in how to have power generation, how to have better communications in the Arctic that does have a Canadian nexus, as was mentioned by my colleagues, that we can be a leader in that R&D to be able to self-generate clean power in the north and use it for the benefits of our northern community as well. Speaking with just to the northern community, I would highlight that we need to continue to embrace the knowledge, their traditional knowledge, and to highlight the fact that with the recent discovery of the HMS Erebus and Terror along the Northwest Passage, that the stories, the traditional stories go back generations from those who say that they knew that there was something there, but were ignored over time, to the local knowledge of our Indigenous people. As far as planning goes, I would posit that we either don't plan and it's a preventative or reactive measure after the fact, or we plan as best we can with what is changing. NORAD and U.S. Northern Command are planning towards climate change. We are looking at whatever aspects there can be out to 2030, 2035 with our Homeland Defense design, and trying to see where that will take us and what aspects we can do to better operate there, to better have infrastructure there, and to have better domain awareness of the threats that are going to be there into the future. Allies and partners, it was great to hear the perspectives from NATO and from Europe, and the fact of the strengths in approaching these problems together are key. And the exercises that we do together and response in Ukraine, emblematic of our ability to work together, but the importance of doing that into the Arctic. And finally, I'll just return to my vignettes just to say, as examples of the challenges, throughout my career that I have seen, that really reflect all of the changing world from fish migration and resource extraction from famine in various parts of the world, and the challenges that we're going to have in drought in North America, along with Africa and others, but in food scarcity, exacerbated by Ukraine, the floods and the domestic resilience that we need within our own country, and the changes within the melting of glaciers and how that affects infrastructure broadly. So clearly, climate change does affect our security. We are trying what we can to plan for, not to prevent, but to plan for, and to bring it into all of our planning as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those very interesting and thought-provoking points. So I don't see any questions from the audience, but I have many questions, so that should be fine for leading the discussion. But I would just like to remind the audience that if they do have some questions that they want to share with the panelists, they can do so from the Slido link that they should have access to. So I would guess that my first question would be a very broad one, maybe just to start up the discussion about, because all of you mentioned a very somewhat broad perspective of our security, especially Ambassador Mann, who said that from the EU perspective, security had to be understood from a wide perspective and not just traditional issues. And so my question would be, do you think that climate change needs to redefine kind of the way we think about security? Because we might fear that in the current context, hard security, which is also a point that has been raised by most of you, hard security perspectives is taking up all space. So how can we make sure that climate change considerations don't take the backseat when we don't have time for them to do so, because they are becoming more and more pressing? So how do we make sure that hard and traditional security issues don't take up all the space and make climate change disappear? So I don't know if anyone of you wants to start.
I could.
Yeah.
Well, go. Whitney, go for it. You go ahead.
Oh, please, Ambassador, I'll follow up.
Okay, listen, I'll be very brief. I mean, I don't see a reason why focusing on one thing should prevent us focusing on another thing. I mean, for a start, the two are intrinsically linked. This is the basis of our discussion today, that, hard security challenges have changed and been exacerbated by the effects of climate change. But we're now also, I mean, we already, from our perspective, as I explained earlier, look at security issues from a very wide perspective, a whole sort of spectrum of different types of defense issues and security issues. So I don't think one excludes the other. Obviously, the fact that the world is focusing on the dreadful events in Ukraine means that that is taking a lot of the headlines, perhaps. But the work on climate change and let's face it, we're not going to solve the problems of climate change in the Arctic. They are not caused in the Arctic. They're caused, south of the Arctic Circle. There's 7.5 billion people sending greenhouse gases into the air outside of the Arctic Circle. That work can continue. And so, I don't see one thing excluding the other. And the only thing I would say is that there is also local work we can do in an Arctic context, or whether it be work on black carbon or permafrost thaw, that is unfortunately affected at the moment, certainly in the short to medium term, by our blocking of Russia. So that is what I was talking about. These last 3 days up here in Norway, I've been discussing how we can actually get that work moving again whilst excluding Russia. And the problem is on things like permafrost is that the expertise is in Russia. And so we can certainly push ahead, but we will have to find smart ways perhaps of definitely excluding the Russian institutions and the government that's responsible for this. But hopefully we can use some of the independent Russian expertise. I don't know how practical that is, but that is something we certainly hope that we'll be able to look at in the future.
Thank you. Whitney, if you want to
Thanks,
go.
if I may, Ambassador, and Pauline, 3 quick points. First of all, I think the debate about security, I mean, this sounds way too academic, but on an ontological level, big questions about whether climate change demands us thinking about planetary security as one of the phrases, something that is a common humanity problem, versus our state-based approaches to security, certainly within the defense sphere, but often in how we think about alliances and constructs, especially in an era of great power competition like we find ourselves now. So I think right there, yes, climate change is going to really stress us in terms of figuring out at what level, appropriate level, do we need to engage this. Secondly, I very much echo the ambassador's comments. There's a danger of setting up a zero-sum competition between hard security and soft security. And it's one of the reasons why I think I'm so insistent of differentiating between technological drivers and climate drivers as causes of Arctic insecurity or global insecurity that spill over to the Arctic. And again, I marry that to my third point, which is why I'd like to emphasize, are we talking about threats through the Arctic, to the Arctic, or in the Arctic? And my argument would be most of the threats through the Arctic deal with technology, and they're born of great power global competition. They affect the Arctic. We may deploy systems to be able to detect and deter and potentially defeat them. But at the end of the day, these are not driven by Arctic issues. The further we get along that spectrum, threats to the Arctic are going to be a blend of technological and climate change driven ones. But the threats to the Arctic, as Ambassador Mann said, caused by climate change, require global action. So we have a levels of analysis problem if we think that we can deal with climate change issues on an Arctic regional level and solve what's inherently global. We could invest all of the GDPs of all of NATO members into addressing militaries and greenhouse gas emissions and eradicate them, and it wouldn't make any substantive difference on accelerated paces of global warming. Third piece is threats in the Arctic. I think many of these challenges are directly born of environmental change coming from climate change, or are exacerbated by climate and environmental changes. So I think there's an area where there's the most direct linkage, but it always begs the question as well, where does DND, where do the Canadian Armed Forces fit in this whole of government, whole of society solution? And what are the risks associated with DND either having foisted upon it through public expectation or political expectation, or by wrongly characterizing Arctic security as covering everything, that means that the CAF gets pulled away from what its core purpose is. And those are big, big political level questions that I think we're going to have to grapple with in the country.
Thank you very much for those very interesting points. And one of the questions I wanted to ask was precisely about Arctic-specific threats, because this is something that I'm very interested in. And most of you mentioned very broad threats and mentioned that threats would be coming from outside the Arctic and have an application in the Arctic. So thanks for touching upon this topic, because I think it was really interesting to think about what would be Arctic-specific. So now we have a lot of questions from the audience. And thinking about probably, I think NATO is coming up a lot, probably also because we have now ideas that maybe Sweden and Finland would want to join NATO. So how do we consider that it might change and have consequences in the Arctic? And yeah, so I don't know if any maybe Kim or Brigadier General would like to start with a few comments about that.
Sure, I'm happy to start. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all seeing the news about the interest of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. And I think that it will create an interesting dynamic for the Arctic region, in that all of the littoral Arctic states, save Russia, would be NATO members if they were to join. So that certainly does, I think that does change the dynamic, especially given the circumstances in which we currently find ourselves with Russia's activities in Ukraine. So I'm not sure exactly what that might do, but I would think that Russia may find that a bit of an aggressive activity. They may wonder about a NATO bloc in the Arctic. I would wonder about what the impact of that might be down the road, if we were ever to be able to restart the Arctic Council, and I take and share the ambassador's viewpoint that we should not be engaging Russia in these discussions at this point in time, given their activities. But I would hope that many, many years down the road, the time may come again where we can all talk together. And if that were to happen, it does create a bit of a block situation where you have sort of this NATO block and then one more. So I don't know how that will all play out, and I think a lot of that depends on how other things are going to play out in the world over the coming years, but it is going to create a very interesting situation and dynamic, and I think an interesting one within NATO itself. Certainly from a Canadian perspective, we have always held and shared with our NATO Arctic allies the view that NATO's Arctic countries should define the NATO position and the NATO policy in the Arctic, and so we will be adding to that discussion, and so I think that changes things as well. So it's certainly an interesting time and an interesting question, and one I think we'll see play out over the next couple of weeks and in some interesting ways. General, I'm not sure if you wanted to add to that.
Sure, thanks. I mean, realizing that I'm representing NORAD here within North America, but I will just touch on your comments about forming a bloc. It does concern me, but at the same token, I think of the hard security into the future, looking 5-10 years down the road, it has been the Arctic Council or things like search and rescue that have been an area of compromise or an area of cooperation. And I would leave that to the diplomats, and the ambassador has great thoughts on when and how we do that again, but there has to be a time in the future. And one more brief snapshot of my career, young Lieutenant Tom Dunn was narrating a search and rescue exercise in Trenton to a Russian audience that was there in the early 90s as part of, and there was also Arctic search and rescue exercises that were routinely done as part of trust building and confidence building. So don't know when that is. Yes, I think Norway, there's opportunities for collaboration with Finland and Sweden. But there also is risk at further demarcating alliance at the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if any other panelists would like to comment. I don't know if Whitney, you had some thoughts about, yeah, I guess Ambassador would not be so inclined, but maybe Whitney would have some.
No, very quick. I agree very much with what both Tom and Kim have said, and would suggest, I think there's interesting questions about what this means in terms of the information domain or cognitive domains, and where we're going to see new or amplified efforts by Russia to want to adopt certain messaging, potentially to divide, NATO members, but also to try to suggest to Russian audiences within their domestic space that this goes to prove all along that this was about NATO aggression, and that Russia is justified in, its heinous, brutal invasion, on the grounds of this was preventative, whatever crap Putin, pardon my language, was, spouting in the last week. So I think thinking about what the implications are in terms of competing for narratives is going to be really, really significant. It already is, but increasingly in the weeks ahead.
Thank you very much. I also have a question that I think is really relevant, that is coming from the city of Whitehorse, sorry, and which will allow us a little bit to talk about maybe people who are actually living in the Arctic and indigenous communities, which we did not talk about so much as of now. So the question is, the city of Whitehorse is heavily reliant on diesel generators to provide power to residents throughout the winter months. So as we speak about moving away from fossil fuels in the Arctic, what actions can we take to ensure that prices for northern residents are sustainable? And so maybe this is a very specific question, but we could maybe broaden the perspective and think about how, the consequences also for of all these shifts that we are talking about for indigenous population living in the Arctic. I don't know who would like to go first on this very topic.
I'm certainly happy to. Oh, please.
Whitney, you and I were timing is perfect. Please, this time you go ahead. This time it's you, okay?
I was going to say very briefly, I mean, this actually, energy security is the topic of the next meeting of the Arctic Security Working Group convening in Whitehorse at the end of this month. And it's actually a forum for members of the federal family, territorial partners, Indigenous organizations, and Indigenous governments to come together and talk about exactly these issues. And I think what the member of our audience is asking is a really key one in terms of building resilience. How do we think about an Arctic where it's not about just single reliance on individual supply chains or whatever, but actually having to build in redundancy across the board? That's in terms of energy, it's in terms of telecommunications. And I really see a very important challenge space, because we're not only talking about heavy expenses in terms of building infrastructure in the north, but the ability to sustain and maintain that infrastructure, I think practically is going to become even more expensive into the future. So how are we making very smart investments, and how are those military or security related investments aligned with the clearly articulated needs of Northerners who have already identified, their persistent gaps and therefore lack of opportunities relating to infrastructure deficits and so on? How do we really open up our imagination? How do we break down departmental silos and governmental silos and start to figure out how we can actually have a coherent plan? And at the same time realize that as much as we often focus on General Dunn, the capabilities that the RCAF brings to bear in terms of HERCs and being able to do search and rescue, at the same time also investing on the incredible capacity we have at local levels all throughout the Canadian North, resident in the Canadian Rangers and Coast Guard Auxiliary and Guardians and all these other people who have tremendous expertise and abilities to ensure that their communities can bounce forward from shocks caused by climate-related emergencies or other ones. So how do we make sure that we're not asking too much of communities who are already offering a tremendous amount, but at the same time are really ensuring that we have a well-calibrated plan to align all of our different efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Whitney. I mean, I see, I'm going to have to be very careful here, because I think the situation in the European Arctic is rather different in many ways to the situation up in Nunavut. So, I mean, I actually have a very interesting example. We were taking on a little trip today outside of Tromsø by the leader of the local county council. And he took us past an enormous wind farm they've built on the top of a mountain here. And, there was an enormous discussion about this, because we all know, and I actually sat on a panel next to the president of the Sami Parliament of Norway yesterday. And there is an enormous amount of nervousness amongst the, justified nervousness amongst the indigenous populations that what seems great in terms of energy production with Michael Mann sitting in his glass office in Brussels isn't necessarily brilliant on the ground. So, wind farms have been a particular point of concern. And we in our new Arctic policy have advocated not only a moratorium on oil and gas drilling, but actually advocated for more mining of critical minerals for the green transition. So these are all issues that have to be so carefully balanced. But I think in the European Arctic context, we have actually managed to do a rather successful shift away from sort of diesel generation on a local level. And we do, as I said before, see the possibility of developing technologies locally in Arctic regions that can then be exported elsewhere. But it's easy for me to say, and it's easier said than done. And we have to provide some sort of bridging for people who are doing this, because we're fighting, on the one hand, we are fighting black carbon, which is a local accelerator of climate change, obviously, but you can't just leave people in the lurch. So I think the European experience is rather different from the Canadian experience, but I think it's a necessity that we do find green sources of energy up north, but that's going to require some some financial support and some technological support as well. So I haven't provided an answer, but at least I've sort of appreciated the difference in situations, I think. I'm terribly good at not providing answers, but I'm doing my best.
No, thank you. That was actually really interesting. I always like how we can separate like circumpolar perspectives from just seeing not just the Arctic, but also several Arctics and differences that have to be underlined between different regions of the Arctic. So I actually thought that was really interesting and relevant. So thank you. I have another question that is about also response and adaptation to climate change, and I think that everyone would be able to provide an interesting insight about this this question. So the question is, do you feel that the current organizations or command structures of the security and defense and diplomatic spheres are well equipped to respond as is to climate change threats, or are more systematic or substantial changes needed? So this is a very broad question. I don't know who would like to go first. Maybe from a defense sphere, maybe Kim would like to go first. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know if I'll speak to command structures. That's more in military lines. But I do think one thing, and it comes back to the first question that you had asked us, Pauline, about do we need to think differently about climate change and security? And I think one area where we do is in how, and this is a very Canadian government bureaucratic answer, but is how the federal government is organized to address the climate threat. And we have traditionally had these spheres in government of, these are your social actors within government and your departments that deal with social issues, and these are your departments that deal with economic issues, and these are your departments that deal in the defense and security sphere. And one of the challenges that we have had in sort of building a climate and security narrative within national defense and more broadly in the government of Canada is trying to make those spheres all come together, because you can't deal with this issue in one of those silos. And so it's really been challenging to figure out how to have the right conversations and how to have a defense conversation on climate resonate with people who are looking at it solely from a social perspective, and how their conversation can resonate for us when we're looking at it from a more defense perspective. And so I do think there needs to be changes in how, as a Canadian government, we're organized and structured to address the consequences of climate change, to prepare for adaptation, to build more resilient communities. I think we have to bring these more siloed parts of government together. So that's my sense, sitting where I've been and trying to build this narrative for the last couple of years. I suspect it translates into the international sphere as well, but I don't have as much experience in that space in order to speak to that. Maybe I'll stop there and see if others want to answer.
Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead, Brigadier General, please.
Sure, I can build on. I mean, I agree completely with Kim and some of the adaptation perhaps within our own government. But I would say again, back to the first question, my opinion on the security and the climate change and how we define that would be that, you know, the operational advantage is what really it comes down to with security and the hard side of security, and informed by climate change and assisted by climate change. Are we really fit for purpose as we're currently organized, I think is how the question, I took it. I won't propose specific changes or thoughts on that, but I would say that we need to continually evaluate that as it changes, and as population changes. I'll use the fire station analogy, where I mean you have spread more and more fire stations where there are larger populations, and if we continue to open up the north, which it seems like we will, and if things continue to be busier there, then we will continue to need more domestic response and security in that context. If it opens up more to threats from abroad, which it seems to be continuing to do, we need to have the ability to see and surveil our territory. So we need to have the capacity to do that. And if we need to change how we're organized, that may be a part of it. As Kim said, there are certain elements within our north, in our response areas, where there's different government organizations have different areas. As we invest in infrastructure in the north, it really behooves us to make sure that we're optimizing for all the different departments, that they can share those great resources. And I'm sure that well outside of my area of expertise, but with the NATO Center of Excellence or the ideas around that there's opportunities there for future development or changes to our structure to optimize that. Thank you.
And if I may, just to jump in and echo the very fine comments there, I think we are at a moment where this encourages us to do some maybe bold thinking about whether some of our structures, and I'm going to focus more on the disaster management system more generally. I mean, does the Canadian Armed Forces desire more responsibility a concerted effort to, as some commentators have suggested, even in the last couple of weeks, for the primary reserves, and this came up in some parliamentary committees, right? Suggestions the primary reserves as almost its primary task should be focused towards what I would call civil preparedness, disaster response. I'm not sure that's the best use of military resources. Peter Kickert, a colleague of mine at St. Francis Xavier, wrote a piece in the Ottawa Citizen in November suggesting maybe we need a Canadian Resilience Corps. Maybe it's time to literally invest resources across different levels of government. So breaking down silos again, to echo the comments of my colleagues here. And how do you resource this but create something that is deliberately civilian? Hopefully very close liaison, synchronization, coordination with military and national response systems. I think the time is now, and hopefully there's a growing appetite to really rethink a lot of our assumptions. And what I very much worry about is the Canadian Armed Forces is going to be set up to fail. And when I mean fail, it's not being able to meet what are unreasonable public expectations, to be able to be everywhere on the planet the Canadians call upon them, and at the same time be everywhere at home to deal with every type of emergency. I really do think we need to have some creative thinking and not, again, see this as somehow clawing resources away from the Canadian Armed Forces, but actually freeing up Canadian Armed Forces resources to focus on, those tasks that the Canadian Armed Forces is uniquely equipped to be able to manage. And I'll also reference, the Public Safety Canada-led national adaptation strategy work going on right now. I think will also help to move in this sort of direction. And then a big part, I think a challenge in that space is figuring out how does DND and the Canadian Armed Forces have a voice within that process. And I won't go going on the need for a national security strategy to provide us with an overarching chapeau, because we're getting on 2 decades overdue for a refresh on that. But I'll leave it there for now.
I mean, if I just to add a brief point from my side, I mean, I think what we always say is that we recognise the sort of primary sovereignty of the Arctic states to deal with problems on their sovereign territory, but on the other hand, there is value added from international cooperation, and that's where organisations like the Arctic Council can come in very handy, but also the cooperation in the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, for example, and we can play our bit as well, because we have these rather advanced, amazing, Earth observation systems through our Copernicus system. So there are ways that we can work together, and obviously in national waters, national navies and so forth would have to play the primary role. But I think there is also here a good, strong argument for international cooperation, where we are more than happy to help out.
Thank you very much. So just to a little update on time, because we only have 4 minutes left, so I will maybe have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I do have a question that ties in very much with this one, but that is specifically dedicated to Whitney, so maybe he will have a short answer for this audience member. So the question is, as the Canadian defense sector considers climate adaptation in the North and the Arctic, do you have any ideas on what some of the greatest problem might rise from maladaptation? I think you pretty much covered it, but maybe if you wanted to stress something out.
Yeah, so I'd say I'm going to twist the question around a little bit and not repeat and say, what do I see in terms of priorities for investment? I think work on ports and small craft harbors that will help to build resilience, not only north-south connectivity, but east-west connectivity or regional connectivity within the Canadian Arctic is key. I think telecommunications infrastructure is an absolutely pivotal enabler and a right for Canadians to be able to access, that not only helps in the security safety space, but also is going to be critical to the defense space, and how NORAD, the general will correct me if I'm wrong in this, but building its E-code layer system and gearing towards information dominance, right, is all about not only having the sensors of all different forms, but being able to ingest that information and process the speed of elements. That's all requiring communication. So again, I see those as 2 really key areas. And then airfields, again, expanding some of our airfields, coming up with the innovative solutions to make sure that they're hardened and are capable of accommodating the fleets that we need looking into the future. And that also includes, unpersoned fleets of vehicles is going to be pretty key. And to me, those are all areas that, yes, they have a defense component to them. They also have very positive potential civilian effects in terms of increasing access and enabling people to have more diversified economic opportunities.
Thank you very much. So I think I will just finish with a question and ask you to give maybe just one tiny point of comment, because we only have 2 minutes left. But it's a question. I lost it. No, that was a question about readiness and risk assessment in the Arctic, and how do we avoid any blind spots regarding the risks that the region face? So what would be the most pressing issue that you would that you would consider? And we only have 1 minute left, so I would ask you to be very brief. If you just had an idea that stand out, that would be awesome to conclude the panel. Yeah,
Sure, I can be brief. I think with military forces, it's the equipment. A lot of the U.S. forces aren't equipped to operate there, and I would say on the Canadian side, I mean, we have probably better equipment and have some expertise, but at the same time, the infrastructure needs, as Whitney just mentioned, from runways and beyond, we need to improve our infrastructure. Thank you.
I would say an even greater level of international cooperation on research, and also an effort to sort of, I mean, we do have the same challenges, and frankly, we probably have the same solutions, and an effort to sort of align our policy priorities as much as possible.
Thank you.
I would say maybe improved all domain awareness. I think we could increase and improve domain awareness across the Arctic.
And my final comment will be ensuring that as we're having these dialogues, we're ensuring that Northerners are part of these conversations, not just at the final end when decisions are already have been made but need to be confirmed, but right from the agenda setting and figuring out where we can have alignments that also are able to deal with defense needs and at the same time address persistent inequities that are a very significant and pressing challenge in the North.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I think now time has run out, so I will leave it to Yuri to take you for the final statement.
All right. Well, thank you.
Congratulations to Pauline for her excellent moderation today, actually. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Stole my thunder right there.
Oh, sorry.
Totally agree.
Yeah,
What a great job that was. Very interesting. You brought out the best in your speakers, and we're really happy to start off the conference with just a great panel. So I think you've kind of raised the bar, all 5 of you. The rest of the panelists for the next 2 days will have some work to do to make sure they're up to the task. So we're going to move on now to a half-an-hour break so that people can go have lunch, and we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much.
Thank you.